Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 262nd episode, our returning guest is Brian VanDeMark. You first heard of Brian VanDeMark on episode 134 of the podcast. Brian VanDeMark grew up and attended college in Texas, went to graduate school in California, and now lives in Maryland. He teaches history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, where he has been a member of its history department since 1990. The author of several books on American history, he co-authored Robert McNamara's #1 best-selling Vietnam memoir, In Retrospect, which became the basis for Errol Morris's Academy Award-winning documentary film, The Fog of War. His book, Road to Disaster, A New History of America's Descent into Vietnam, was published by HarperCollins in 2018. His latest book, Kent State, An American Tragedy, was published by W.W. Norton and Company in August 2024. And now on to the show.
I'm about halfway through your book right now. It's really interesting. Congratulations on the book. It's very good. I actually got the idea to call you back about coming on the podcast because I was reading the New York Times book review and there was a mention of it, and I was like, oh, hey, I know that guy.
Yeah,
I should read that book because I was enjoying your last one a lot. So
I appreciate that. As you know, it's a very sensitive topic.
Oh wow,
particularly for people of a particular generation.
Yeah,
and, there's a lot of emotion that surrounds that tragedy, and I think for people who didn't live it, I mean, I was 10 at the time. I remember it happened. It was shocking to me. But for anyone older than that who was in college at that time, it was a defining moment. I've gotten a lot of emails from people who read the book who were in college at that time, and they just reiterated what I just mentioned to you, that it had a profound impact on them. And it's still shocking to look back on it in hindsight now.
It is. Absolutely. It's just like, I mean, people in the book say this over and over, but like, is this America? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
yep.
Can you even believe this is happening? And it's like, you see the pictures that you have, scattered through your book, and it doesn't look like America that I know. Like, and, and we'll get to this later, but the gas masks are a particularly ominous sight.
Yes, they are.
And they play a big part in the story. I didn't realize that aspect of it before I started reading. But for people that don't know what we're talking about and maybe weren't alive like me, I mean, I heard of it, but obviously I wasn't alive when it happened. But talk a little bit about, and you do a good job of setting the stage at the beginning of the book with the times we're living in, right? Because it's very informed by, of course, everything going on around Kent State.
Yes. Well, like today, the late 60s and early 70s was a time of a deeply polarized American society along cultural and political lines, very reminiscent of today. The Vietnam War had become hugely controversial. America was failing in that effort. It generated a lot of pressure for some Americans to do more to win, and for many other Americans to get out. And colleges were an integral part of this, because until 1969, if you were in college, you had an exemption from the draft. And that, I think, created a lot of dynamics, too, that accentuated the controversy. I think people who were in college at the time, who opposed the war for moral reasons and political reasons, also felt some degree of tension and ambivalence about the fact that they were exempted from exposure to the draft, whereas farm boys, inner city kids whose parents couldn't afford to send them to college got exposed to the draft and sent to Vietnam. So it created a lot of anxiety, a lot of emotion, a lot of tension. And when you combine that with the division of the American public in terms of its opinion on the war, it was a very combustible atmosphere. And that's similar to today in some respects. People have asked me, what do I see that speaks to today? And it's that dangerous polarization of American society, which is a very combustible atmosphere. And it led to tragedy in 1970. And God forbid something like that repeats itself in the months and years ahead here. But it's
Mm-hmm.
it's that mixture of ingredients that create a lot of tension and a lot of polarization and a lot of tension
Mm-hmm.
that is dangerous.
Right. And, one of my favorite authors is Hunter S. Thompson, and he has this great speech in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas about the Summer of Love, which was a
Mhm.
couple of years before this, and how you can see, like, if you just look over the horizon with the right set of eyes, you can see where the wave crested. And obviously, when you're talking about here, the wave has definitely crested. I mean, we've got the murder of MLK,
Yeah,
RFK. We've got, I don't know when Altamont happened, but it had to be around the same
it
time.
was 69, shortly
69,
before.
exactly. It's like the good feelings are being sucked out of the room. And right now we've
Yeah,
got a
and
lot going
remember
on.
too that there are far more Southeast Asians who died in the Vietnam War than Americans did by an order of magnitude. But the bloodiest years of the war in terms of American casualties were 1968 and 1969, which are the years that lead up to the spring of 1970. So it's a highly tense atmosphere in a country which is deeply divided, and the emotional intensity of the divergence of opinion is very powerful. Some of it is generational, but some of it, even within college age students, um, reflected the collapse of the center. The center essentially implodes into non-existence by the late 60s and early 70s. People are moving to the right or to the left. And when that happens, the ability to bridge the gap becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible. And I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say that today is identical to that, but it's not dissimilar in the sense that the center in American politics in our era is in deep trouble. People tend to move to the left and to the right. And when that happens, the ability to find common ground becomes a lot more difficult. And as I pointed out in that introductory chapter, which sort of sets the scene, by early 1970, people on the left basically viewed people on the right as unpatriotic monsters and vice versa. And when you view the other in that fashion, it's a recipe for potential disaster because you're not going to communicate with one another, and it's very difficult to empathize or even try to understand where they're coming from or give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's true today, and it was certainly true then.
Well, and you even have all these great scenes leading up to this where it's like the National Guardsmen are playing euchre, very
Yep.
Midwestern thing to do, by the way. I live in Indiana. I was like, of course they played euchre.
It's a good point that you
What
made,
card
Rob.
game do you think I played the last time me and my friends got together and played cards and played guitar? It was double-handed euchre, but it was euchre,
Yeah, and I confess, not being from the Midwest, I'm unfamiliar with the game, but
Okay.
yeah, and they were tossing the frisbee with one another. The guardsmen were socializing with the
Hmm.
female Kent State students on the day before all this happened. I
Hmm.
mean, it's just the juxtaposition of that is really jarring.
Yeah. We have to, there's so much I want to talk about because there's so many interesting, rich details in this book, but there's a real tension with, like you mentioned, the draft. Up until a certain time, if you were in college, you got out of it. And then that wasn't even enough, right? Because then they put people's birthdays into the lottery system. And then if you had a high number, you were like more likely to go. That was how it worked.
Well, actually, the college exemption from the draft was ended in 1969 because there was a
Ah.
growing realization that it was essentially unfair for economic reasons. So college students became exposed to the draft in 1969 for the first time. And I mean, that's going to ratchet up the politicization of Vietnam on campuses dramatically because now
Hmm.
these students who are post the war realize that they might end up over in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And the war is continuing despite the fact that the American public support for the war is diminishing.
Right.
Um, and the way the draft system worked was it was a lottery, and the lower the number that got drawn, and each birth date had a number attached to it, the lower it was, the much likelier it was you're going to get drafted. So if your number was 365, you were golden. If it was one, you were going to get drafted.
Oh my.
And I think in 1969, they inducted people up through 195. So just imagine the tension of that as those birth dates are getting drawn.
Ugh,
It makes it all very real.
right.
And that's just more fuel on the fire, so to speak. And that lottery drawing was in December of 1969. Kent State occurred in May of 1970. So
Yeah,
there's a linkage there too.
for sure. And then even beyond that, we have the ROTC on
Yep.
campus, which if it's like, well, I'm going to get drafted anyway, I may as well be an officer. Is that the thinking?
Well, I think a lot depended on up until 69. Again, if you were in college and you didn't fail or drop out, you were essentially exempt from the draft. But those who joined the ROTC did it for a variety of reasons, some patriotic, some financial, because it was essentially a full scholarship. And others thought, well, if the day comes where I might be exposed to the draft, I'd rather enter the military as a commissioned officer than as a grunt. So, there are a variety of motivations, I think, that attracted people to the ROTC programs. But it had become a symbol of the war for a lot of students post Vietnam War. And it was a hated symbol. I mean, today you and I live in an era in which the military's reputation in American society is sky high. But the Vietnam War had devastated the reputation and prestige of the military, particularly among younger Americans. And for a lot of people post the war who loathed the military, an ROTC presence on campus was just outrageously inflammatory to them. They are deeply opposed to the presence, and a lot of schools will eventually pick ROTC off campus. They're only returned many decades later. I think, for example, the Ivy schools like Harvard and Yale, they ended ROTC programs in the late 60s or early 70s because of what I've just described to you. And those ROTC programs were not resuscitated at those schools until about 10 years ago.
Wow. Interesting. Well, because, okay, so all this, particularly at Kent State, kicks off because, I mean, a lot of reasons, but I think the flashpoint is disturbance of some kind, and then the ROTC building gets burned down on campus.
Yeah, I would say that, there's a lot of kindling that's being built up.
Oh, yeah.
But the trigger, the spark, is when Nixon announces an incursion into Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
As I explained in the book, the American people had basically turned against the war by that point. So the debate wasn't over anything other than how fast to get out. And even Nixon was beginning to draw down the American troop presence in Vietnam. He was doing it gradually at a time when public opinion was moving beyond him and favoring a more rapid scheduled withdrawal. And the military commander of American forces there in the spring of 1970 essentially advised him, if you're going to draw down American troops in Vietnam, you need to deal with these communist sanctuaries in Cambodia, because they created an exposure and a risk to these American soldiers whose numbers are dwindling. And that's why Nixon announced the incursion into Cambodia. The problem with that was he had run for president in 1968 on a promise that he had a secret plan to end the war. It had made it very clear to the American people that his desire was to terminate the war and to get out. And this incursion appeared to be contradictory evidence of exactly the opposite of that. And that infuriated many college students who were opposed to the war, because they felt that he was essentially not keeping his promise and making the war bigger again, which is exactly what they and a lot of the American people said they did not want.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you don't really go into this, like, you don't have, I mean, how could you? You can't cover everything, but like Nixon also wasn't his pitch in 1968 is that he had a secret peace plan?
Yeah, he tapped his coat pocket, saying
Wow.
I have a secret plan to end the war. And,
but in reality, it's come out now that he actually was working behind the scenes to scuttle peace negotiations.
Correct.
In violation of the Logan Act, as I understand it. But
correct.
But I guess since presidents have complete immunity now, Nixon would be thrilled with that one.
Well, if only.
Yeah, right.
In politics, politicians would not use as sort of their determining factor expediency. And Nixon is an egregious example of that. I don't think he's the first or last one who makes promises that are not kept, or implies A and does B. But again, the thing about the Cambodia incursion in the spring of 1970 was it inflamed opposition to Nixon and to the war, because the short-term consequence of that was an expansion of the war. And many Americans had voted for him in 1968 because he had promised to end American involvement in the war. Now, he doesn't go to the trouble of explaining in very much depth to the American people why he's doing this. I mean, he was essentially getting pressured by the military hierarchy in Vietnam that this needed to be done to protect the withdrawal of American troops. But he doesn't explain it that way, or doesn't go into very much depth. And I think the impression that created in the minds of a lot of people was this guy's he's speaking with the forked tongue, and he's doing exactly what he's promised he wouldn't do. And the net effect of it was it just ratcheted up the tension on campus and hatred for the war and hatred for him on the part of opponents of the war dramatically.
Right. But okay, so going back to the timeline of events here. So Nixon, Cambodia, big outpouring of demonstration. ROTC building gets knocked down. Some local businesses are vandalized. And the National Guard, Ohio National Guard, is brought in.
Yes.
So they had, first of all, another important detail in your book is they were just coming off a Teamsters strike, right? Because they'd already been on for a while. And this was like, and one more thing you didn't plan on. Here it comes. And you're arrested at all. So
they've dispatched to Kent directly from dealing with the Teamsters strike in Akron. And they had been on duty for days and gotten very little sleep. Then they arrive in Kent to confront this situation. And the fact of the matter is, it's just a recipe for disaster because they're tired, they're exhausted, they're not trained to cope with student protests. They had been trained to fight, kill, and win wars, and to some degree deal with urban riots in inner cities. And here they are sent to a college campus to serve what is effectively a police function for which they have zero training. And the only instruments that they're equipped with are essentially tear gas and infantry rifles with high velocity bullets. They didn't have batons. They didn't have plastic shields. They didn't have all those intermediate measures and methods that would enable you to cope with disturbances short of applying lethal force. I mean, you look at it in hindsight now, and it was just a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. But going back to the whole draft situation, the National Guard, if you joined the National Guard, that meant you didn't have to go to Vietnam, correct?
It's very unlikely. I mean, if the Guard was mobilized for service in Vietnam, you would go, but that rarely, if ever, happened during the Vietnam War. It happened in World War II, for example, and I think in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
But the Vietnam War was fought with draftees. And there was a widespread understanding on the part of many people who joined the Guard during the Vietnam era that this was a way of avoiding service in Vietnam. And, that generated resentment toward them on the part of Vietnam veterans who felt like they were dodging service in the jungle of Vietnam. But joining the military made them look like villains in the eyes of students who hated the military and were passionately opposed to the war.
So and I appreciate you took a stance a couple times in the narrative, because you have to say something happened, of saying this happened, and you might have a footnote saying this guy was like in a court document or something. But who is ultimately responsible for? There's a couple of, I mean, like it's not a comedy. It's not a comedy, so it's not a comedy of errors, but it's like
the tragedy of errors.
Tragedy of errors, exactly. And they're with live ammunition, fixed bayonets, on zero sleep. They're sleeping on the floor in some cases.
Maybe 2 hours of sleep a night for a week.
They're completely disregarding the First Amendment. The First Amendment doesn't exist as far as they're concerned.
Well, not the guardsmen themselves, but the officers
who that's what
running that show.
Who is ultimately responsible for these terrible, terrible mistakes?
Okay. When something tragic like that happens, the tendency on the part of most human beings is to look for someone to blame, because I think that's human nature, and there's a fair amount of blame to go around. That having been said, to me, the two most culpable individuals in this story were the governor of Ohio at the time, Jim Rhodes, who sent the Guard into Kent against the advice of the university officials who wanted to use the Ohio State Highway Patrol as a last resort. And Rhodes was warned privately by the county prosecutor where the city of Kent is located on Sunday afternoon, May 3rd, that deploying the guard on campus in this atmosphere was inviting a tragedy in which people were going to get killed. And Rhodes ignored that advice because he was running as a law and order candidate in the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate seat, which was going to be, that primary election was going to be held on Tuesday, May 5th. And I think he had personalized this issue. To him, it was a law and order matter, and he was just going to deal with this rabble by sending in the National Guard to impose law and order. The problem with that, as I mentioned before, is they weren't trained for that. These guys were trained to fight and kill, not to serve a police function. And not only had they been not trained for this, they didn't have the equipment to deal with crowd control. They had rifles with high velocity bullets. And you look back on that in hindsight now, and it's just appalling to think about the dangers and risks that are being created when you dispatch a force that's structured like that and lacking training into an environment such as that. I think the other individual who bears a lot of responsibility was the commanding officer of the National Guard on May 4th at Kent State. His name was Robert Canterbury. He was the number 2 in the Ohio National Guard hierarchy, and he was the senior officer at Kent State that day. And his judgment was just abysmal. He made the decision to disperse the crowd, even though a lot of the junior officers beneath him and even enlisted guardsmen later testified that that crowd was not being violent. He used about 100 guardsmen to confront a crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 people. So these guardsmen are outnumbered in the neighborhood of 30 to 1. They're nervous. They lack training. They're armed with guns that have been loaded with live ammunition. And Canterbury had a statutory responsibility to notify the crowd that those rifles were loaded with live ammunition, and he did not give that notice, which to me is just recklessly irresponsible and unconscionable. Those students didn't realize that the guardsmen that they were confronting and baiting and provoking had live bullets in their rifles. It's just astounding when you look back at that now, realize how the poor judgment that Canterbury exercised that day. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't want to lay it all at his feet, but again, if I'm being honest in terms of my assessment of poor judgment and poor leadership, he's right at the top of that list that day.
And he was right in the mix, which is unusual, as I understand from what Rick said, for someone of his rank to be out
in the field.
Yeah,
right. And he wasn't wearing a uniform; he was wearing a suit.
Yeah, what if?
Wow. It's, I don't know. It's, you just want to cry when you look back on this now. Those who recognized him, who were in the Guard at Kent State, a lot of them were stunned that one of the high-ranking generals in the Ohio Army National Guard was present on campus. And I think what that created in their mind was even greater fear. Like, oh my God, if a general is in the field here, this must be a really dangerous, serious situation. So I think it intensified their insecurity and anxiety. And some of them didn't even recognize him or know who he was. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was the commanding officer. And I don't know, it's just a tragic errors in hindsight in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And we touched on this earlier, but those gas masks, I mean, wow, what a regrettable in all this, because it's just, there's so many dimensions why that's a bad idea. First of all, the people with glasses can't see.
Yeah, and they were forced to take their glasses off in order to don their gas masks.
Armor-piercing bullets with long rifles affixed with bayonets.
Yeah.
And
wearing gas masks, which they cannot see because they had to take their glasses off to put on the gas mask.
Exactly.
It severely compromised their peripheral vision. Yeah. And it also made hearing very difficult, i.e. hearing orders or commands. Mm-hmm. It's stupendously tragic.
And then it creates a barrier even psychologically between them and the people on the other side of the gas masks.
Yes, because they don't see the human faces behind them.
Exactly.
So, it just diminishes even more whatever empathy that those students might have felt for the guardsmen as human beings, because now they look like alien creatures.
Well, exactly. And that's the other dimension of it, is the people looking at them.
Yep.
These don't look like, and that's part of the surreal nature of the whole scenario, is like, I was like, is this a science fiction novel or something? Like who like walks around in public like this and
Yes.
expects people to be calm, you know?
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree, Rob. And you look at it in hindsight now, and it's just the errors of judgment and stupidity that were exercised that day by people in Canterbury are just, I don't know.
Okay.
They're textbook examples of what not to do.
Yeah. But as you say in the beginning of your book, you're able to bring new things to light through your own interviews and research. Talk a little bit about what's new with this book. What does this add to? So, as I always want to know, because it's a great book and I'm really enjoying it. But how do you cover such a well-worn subject and find something new in it, which it seems like you did?
Well, I've answered in a couple of ways. One is most histories of what happened that day have been based on accounts provided by the students. And part of the reason for that, much of the reason, in fact, is that the guardsmen who were there that day have rarely talked about it for a lot of different reasons. Trauma, guilt, fear of legal repercussions, or all of the above. So their side of the story has essentially been silent up until now. And I thought to myself, how can you tell this story in 360 degrees if you're only dealing with evidence from one of two sides of the puzzle? I said, how do I rectify this? And the two ways that I dealt with that were I dug very deeply in the archival record, especially the records at Yale, where most of the legal documentation related to the criminal and civil suits against the guardsmen are deposited. It's an enormous collection. There's a lot there. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of depositions and court testimony, statements that the guardsmen made to the FBI after the shooting, to the Ohio State Highway Patrol, etc. And that's a way of recapturing and conveying what happened and their account of what happened in real time, essentially close to the event. The other thing I did was I compiled a list of all of the guardsmen who were at the top of the Blanket Hill when the shooting occurred, or as many of them as I could identify. And I wrote to every one of them. I decided it would be rude and ill-mannered to just cold call them. So I wrote them a letter requesting an interview, asking them to please share their impressions and their recollections and their side of the story. Very few of them responded to me. I don't know, I probably wrote 60 or 70 people, and I got positive replies from less than 10. But those who did agree to talk to me were very candid with me. They shared a lot of information and insights that are very difficult to grasp if you weren't there and experienced it from their point of view. And one of them, arguably the most crucial witness, who was a guardsman, was a platoon sergeant named Matthew McManus. And I began the book by discussing the interview I conducted with him. Mm-hmm. And what's so crucially important about that is, for 50 years, he withheld the whole truth. He had said at the time and immediately thereafter for years that he had issued an order to fire in the air after the shooting began. And when I reached out to him, he wrote me a long letter. I spoke to him by phone. And it was obvious to me that there was something on his mind. He wanted to get something off his chest. And he said, in essence, the time has come for me to just lay it all out for you. I don't want to do this over the phone. If you want to talk to me face to face, then I'm willing to do that. So I flew out to Cleveland. I drove down to Worcester where he lived. And I met with him. And during that interview, he explained exactly what happened. It was the whole truth and not just some of it. He did issue an order to fire in the air, But he confessed that order was issued immediately before the firing began, rather than after it started. He had told the FBI, courts, etc., that he had issued that firing air order after the shooting started. The truth was, he gave that order immediately prior to the shooting, and that's what triggered the shooting. And as I explain in the book, what's so chillingly, soberingly tragic about this is that he issued that order in an effort to prevent bloodshed. But the problem was there was so much confusion and noise at that point, and these guardsmen who were wearing these gas masks, their hearing was impaired. And I think what happened was some guardsmen, or guardsmen plural, either heard only the first word of that order, F-I-R-E, and reacted, or just impulsively decided, okay, the order's been given, I feel threatened, I'm angry, and I'm going to act out now. But what is so painfully tragic about that is that the shooting was precipitated as a result of an order issued by a young man under a lot of pressure who was seeking to prevent bloodshed. And instead, it triggered just that. And that was a traumatic burden that McManus kept secret for more than 50 years. And, he told me, he said, I've had 2 serious heart operations. I just want to come totally clean. And I think, of course, that he should have told the whole truth then. He should have told the whole truth to the FBI, to courts under oath, etc. He didn't. But I think he wanted to set the record straight. And by doing so, he essentially admits that he was responsible for a tragedy, not for the wrong reason. I mean, he tried to do the right thing, and it ended up being a terribly wrong thing to do because of all of these other factors that I've described to you. And when you view the shooting in that regard, it just breaks your heart.
Yeah. Context means a lot.
Yeah.
But there's a famous, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a famous photograph of a pistol that looks like it's been fired.
Correct.
Okay, because I've actually encountered this because I interviewed David Crosby once before he died, R.I.P.
Yeah.
But it was the reason I was interviewing him because he had a documentary coming out called "You Will Remember My Name," during which he goes to the Kent State Museum and points to and talks about that photo.
Yes.
Of course, he was part of CSNY that did the Ohio song.
Yes.
Later after this happened, but talk about that photo and just what happened as well as you can explain it.
Okay. Of course, the most detailed and nuanced description that I can offer you is in the book.
Of course.
And it involved a sergeant who was at the top of the hill at the moment the firing began. His name was Myron Pryor, Pryor. He had a .45 caliber pistol, and he was photographed aiming that pistol downhill toward the students. And many people assumed that was the fact that he initiated the shooting and was responsible for everything that occurred as a result of the first shot. The FBI examined that handgun and interviewed him in great depth and great detail. And again, I'm skipping over a lot of specifics, but they came to the conclusion that he never fired the weapon. He pointed it, but he never fired it. And but if you look at a photo, it looks like he's shooting that gun.
Right.
And again, the irony is he was one of the first ones to turn around and aim downhill toward the students. But that was an effort to deter them from getting any closer. In other words, they didn't turn around, point their weapons downhill, and start pulling triggers. They earlier that morning, the same kind of thing had happened down on the practice field, where some of these student protesters were getting closer to them, and the guardsmen reacted under orders to point their rifles toward the students to deter them from coming closer. That same kind of thing was repeated at the top of the hill because they felt like they were about to get rushed. It was and McManus saw them turn and point their weapons downhill because he didn't have a gas mask on. He was behind them and his peripheral vision wasn't compromised. He saw all this happening. these weapons coming down. And he thought, oh my God, I need to do something to prevent a catastrophe.
Mm.
That's why he issued an order to fire in the air, and he had a shotgun that he had never used before. He pointed it up at a 50-degree angle and pulled the trigger when he said fire in the air. And that set off everything that happened afterwards.
Right. Well, everyone should go obviously buy your book and read it for the full. It's like it's over 300 pages. So,
Yeah,
there's a lot more there than what we could get to in the time we have. But well, great. Well, thank you for coming back. I really hope that it's not as long as it was the first time before we talk again. This is great. I could think of so many more things to talk about you with this or anything else. But one question I do ask before we go, as you know, is what music have you been listening lately?
Well, I mean, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song, I was in my head. For a lot of people who live that era, they immediately identify with that song because it evokes memories of Kent State. And I think what's so powerful about that is that for that generation, as we talked about at the beginning of this discussion, that was a seminal event. It was a trauma. It was shocking. It's still shocking in a lot of ways. And music is it's a very powerful emotional trigger. And I think that song kind of epitomizes all of that.
Oh, yeah.
But the point I want to come back to is what is so unnervingly disturbing about all this is that shooting was precipitated by someone who was trying to do the right thing and ended up being exactly the wrong thing to do.
Mm.
He issued that order to fire in the air to prevent bloodshed, and instead it precipitated it. And I mean, you contemplate the implications of that, and it's just it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, and of course he, had the best of intentions, it sounds like, but so many things led up to that were outside of him, that, you know what I mean? Like he played his part.
He wasn't solely responsible. I mean, in many respects.
Why was he even there to play that part,
Yeah. You could make a very powerful argument that was General Canterbury's ineptitude and his stunning lack of judgment that put all of those guardsmen in that situation. It put someone like that McManus in a position where he felt like he had to do something to prevent a catastrophe. Instead, it triggered a catastrophe.
Right.
And just the burden that he still carries is so painfully obvious. But it also brings closure, I think, for the victims, because I think it helps them understand why it happened. I think for a long time they did not understand why the shooting began. And a lot of people, when you don't know, you make assumptions or you project onto a situation what you believe explains certain behaviors. And in a sense, this bloodshed was inadvertently precipitated by someone who was trying to do the right thing, which makes the tragedy even more tragic.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, like I said, thank you for coming back. Everyone should read your book. It's great as usual. Very interesting. Hope you are well and continue writing books, because I will.
Well, I appreciate that, Rob. And again, the other thing I hope readers will do is read the book, is to not only reflect on human weaknesses, human failures, human vulnerabilities, but also the chilling parallels between 1970 and today.
Yeah.
And the risks that can come, they're inherent in an atmosphere that's combustible, where you have a country deeply divided culturally and politically between two sides that are just essentially unwilling or unable to understand the other. And that's setting up a tragedy in 1970, and something like that could happen again if people aren't careful.
soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know? Gotta get down to it. Soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know? Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. 4 days